The elevator doors part on the 40th floor, and the first thing you hear is his laugh, that same booming, dismissive laugh you've carried in the back of your mind for 6 years, echoing down a hallway of glass and steel that, as of 11 o'clock this morning, legally belongs to you. You're holding a manila folder against your chest. The same posture you had the last time you stood in a room with Sterling Voss. Except back then the folder held a business plan he called cute, and today it holds a deed. Your heels click against the marble floor of Voss Dynamics headquarters, and every step feels like it's been 6 years in the making, because in a way it has. You are Verity Ashgrove, 34 years old, and in about 4 minutes, you're going to sit across from the man who laughed you out of a boardroom and tell him calmly, the way your father taught you to deliver hard truths, that his lease renewal is now entirely up to you. If you've ever had someone look you dead in the eye and tell you that you'd never amount to anything, stay with me to the end of this one. Because what happens in the next few minutes is going to remind you that the people who underestimate you are usually the ones building the very ladder you'll one day climb over them on. And if stories like this speak to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because there's a lot more where this came from. 6 years ago, you were 28 years old and running on 4 hours of sleep and a dream that felt too big for the studio apartment you were living in above a laundromat, in a city you'd moved to with nothing but a car full of boxes and a business plan you'd spent 3 years perfecting. Your father, Wendell Kestrel, had spent 35 years as a commercial real estate appraiser, walking you through buildings on weekends when you were a little girl, teaching you to read a property, the way other fathers taught their kids to read box scores. He used to say that most people looked at a building and saw walls. He saw potential, square footage, foot traffic, zoning loopholes, the quiet arithmetic of a neighborhood on the rise before anyone else noticed. You grew up doing math homework in the passenger seat of his pickup truck while he measured lot lines, and somewhere along the way, without either of you quite realizing it, he'd handed you the exact set of eyes you'd need for the fight that was coming. He passed when you were 25, suddenly a heart attack in his sleep. And you inherited 2 things from him: a modest life insurance payout that felt both enormous and nowhere near enough, and a head full of instincts about buildings and land that most people spend decades in the industry trying to develop. You spent the next 3 years turning those instincts into something real. A business plan for a boutique commercial real estate fund, one that would specifically target overlooked, undervalued properties in transitional neighborhoods. The kind of buildings big investment firms dismissed as not institutional grade, because they didn't understand what your father had taught you to see in them. You practiced that pitch in the mirror, above your bathroom sink until you could deliver it in your sleep. You practiced it on the drive to work, at the property management firm where you answered phones and processed lease applications for people with far less vision than you, biting your tongue every single day, while you watched decisions get made by men who couldn't tell a load-bearing wall from a decorative one. You saved every dollar you could. You built spreadsheets so detailed that even your harshest internal critic couldn't find a flaw in the underlying logic. And when you finally secured a 15-minute pitch meeting with Voss Dynamics, a firm known for backing exactly the kind of scrappy, high-upside real estate ventures you were proposing, you walked into that boardroom in the only good blazer you owned, heart hammering so hard you could feel it in your throat, and you gave the best 15 minutes of your professional life. Sterling Voss sat at the head of a long glass table, flanked by 4 junior partners who all seemed to take their cues directly from the tilt of his head. He was maybe 40 then, sharp-suited, the kind of handsome that came with its own gravitational pull in a room, the kind of confidence that had never once in his life been genuinely tested. You remember the way he leaned back in his chair about 6 minutes into your presentation, arms crossed, a small, amused smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The smile of a man who had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for you to catch up to it. When you finished, when you laid out the 5-year projections, the acquisition targets, the exact reasoning behind every undervalued property on your list, there was a silence in that room that lasted just a beat too long. And then Sterling Voss laughed. Not cruelly exactly. That was almost the worst part. It was a light, genuinely amused laugh. The kind you'd give a child who'd just announced they were going to be an astronaut and a professional soccer player at the same time. "This is cute," he said, tapping the printed folder in front of him with 2 fingers. "Genuinely. But you're talking about buildings nobody with real capital wants to touch, in neighborhoods that won't turn for another decade, if ever, backed by a fund with, what? No offense, zero track record and a founder who's never closed a deal larger than an apartment lease. I appreciate the hustle, I do. But this isn't a business plan. Ms. Ashgrove, this is a very well-organized daydream. You remember exactly how the room felt after that. The junior partner's polite, uncomfortable laughter, the particular flavor of humiliation that settles into your chest and takes up residence there for longer than you'd like to admit. You remember thanking him for his time in a voice that came out steadier than you felt, gathering your folder, and walking out of that building with your spine straight and your eyes burning, refusing to let a single tear fall until you were safely inside your car in the parking garage 3 blocks away. You didn't quit. That's the part people always assume happens next, and it's the part that never happened. You went home that night, and instead of shelving the plan, you rewrote it. Not because Sterling Voss had been entirely wrong about the risk. He hadn't been, but because he'd been wrong about you, and about what you were willing to sacrifice to prove it. You started small, smaller than you'd originally planned. Instead of a fund backed by outside investors, you scraped together every dollar of your inheritance and your savings and bought a single, unremarkable half-vacant 3-story building in a neighborhood everyone else had written off, the same kind of overlooked property your father used to point at from the truck window and say quietly, "That one's going to surprise people someday." You did the numbers yourself, negotiated the purchase yourself, and spent every weekend for 8 months doing renovation work, alongside a small crew, learning to patch drywall and rewire outlets because you couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it, and still keep the lights on. You filled that first building slowly, a print shop, a family-owned pharmacy, a dance studio for kids whose parents couldn't afford the price your place downtown. You didn't gouge anyone on rent. You built relationships instead, the way your father used to, treating every tenant like a partner in something bigger than a lease agreement. And within 18 months, that neighborhood, the one Sterling Voss had dismissed as a decade from turning, started turning. Not because of luck, but because you and a handful of other people who actually lived and worked there had quietly, patiently invested in it while everyone else was still looking the other way. You bought a second building, then a third. You never took outside investors, not because you were against it, but because after that boardroom, some stubborn part of you needed to build this entirely on your own terms, with your own money, answerable to no one who might one day look at you across a glass table and decide you were a daydream instead of a plan. Every acquisition was smaller and quieter than what a firm like Voss Dynamics would have touched, but every single one of them worked. Because you understood something they didn't. You understood the buildings. And more importantly, you understood the people inside them. By the time you turned 32, you owned 11 properties across the city, all fully leased, all profitable, all acquired without a single outside dollar. You were, by any reasonable definition, exactly the kind of success story that gets written up in trade publications. Except you deliberately kept a low profile because a part of you, the part still holding onto that boardroom laugh, wanted to build something undeniable before anyone came looking to take credit for having believed in you early. Which brings you to 8 months ago, when your commercial broker, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Araminta Fox, called you with an opportunity that made you sit down at your kitchen table and go very quiet for a full minute before responding. "There's a building coming up for sale downtown," Araminta said. "Prime commercial tower, fully leased. Anchor tenant on a long-term contract with 3 years left on the lease. Current owners looking to liquidate fast. Divorce situation. Needs the capital. It's a bigger acquisition than anything you've done before. Verity, but the fundamentals are rock solid. Want the details?" You did. And when the details came through, the tenant list, the lease terms, the anchor tenant's corporate name printed in clean black, letters at the top of the file, you had to read it twice to make sure you weren't imagining it. Voss Dynamics. Floors 32 through 40. A lease locked in at a rate that, given current market conditions, was going to become significantly favorable to whoever owned the building the moment renewal. Negotiations opened, because Sterling Voss's own real estate team had, ironically, negotiated an aggressive long-term rate years earlier that no longer reflected the tower's actual value. You sat with that information for exactly one night, turning it over the way your father used to turn over a property listing, looking for the catch, the flaw, the thing that would make this too good to be true. You didn't find one. It was simply cleanly the best acquisition of your career, attached almost unbelievably to the one name from your past you'd never quite managed to stop thinking about. You didn't buy the building for revenge. You want to be honest about that even now, even knowing how satisfying the story sounds when it's framed that way. You bought it because it was, on every measurable level, an excellent investment, the kind of building your father would have circled twice on a listing sheet. The fact that Sterling Voss happened to be your primary tenant was, you told yourself at the time, simply an extraordinary coincidence. The acquisition took 4 months to close. Araminta handled most of the negotiations. Under the entity name of your holding company, Ashgrove Property Group, which meant Sterling Voss and his team had no reason to connect the sale to you personally until the paperwork was already finalized and the deed had legally transferred. You remember sitting in Araminta's office the day everything closed, signing the final documents with a pen that felt heavier than it should have, and feeling something settle in your chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief, something closer to the quiet, complicated satisfaction of watching a very long chapter of your life finally arrive at its ending. The lowest point, if you're being fully honest, didn't come during the boardroom humiliation 6 years ago. It came the night before you closed on that building, when you sat alone at your kitchen table with your father's old appraisal notebooks spread out in front of you, the same worn, coffee-stained notebooks he used to carry into every property he ever walked through. And you found yourself wishing, more than you'd let yourself wish for anything in years, that he could have been there to see it. You cried that night quietly, the way you'd learned to do in that parking garage 6 years earlier, except this time the tears weren't from humiliation. They were from the specific, aching loneliness of achieving something enormous with no one left who fully understood what it had cost you to get there. You called your closest friend and former colleague Idris Whitlock, the only person who'd stood by you through every renovation weekend, every sleepless spreadsheet night, every quiet doubt you never let anyone else see. Idris had left the property management firm 2 years after you did, unable to stomach the same culture of small-minded decision-making you'd walked away from, and had been helping you manage tenant relations ever since. You built this, Idris said simply, over the phone that night. Every single brick of it. Your father would be so proud he wouldn't even have the words for it. And you know that. You believed him mostly. It's just that some griefs don't fully listen to reassurance, no matter how true it is. The morning of the closing, you stood in front of the mirror in your apartment. A real apartment now. Not the studio above the laundromat. And you put on the same style of blazer you'd worn into that boardroom 6 years earlier, deliberately, though you couldn't have entirely explained why at the time. Something in you needed the symmetry. You didn't march into Voss Dynamics that first week waving the news like a trophy. You let the transition happen quietly. Through Araminta and your management team, the way any professional property transfer should happen. Updated ownership notices, new point of contact information, standard administrative correspondence that Sterling Voss's office almost certainly filed away without a second glance. Because why would the CEO of a firm that size personally review a change of landlord notice? It was the lease renewal meeting, scheduled for 8 months into your ownership, that finally brought you face to face with him. Standard practice, Araminta explained. With 3 years left on the original lease, but renewal negotiations traditionally opening early for a tenant of that size. The new ownership group typically requested an introductory meeting. You could have sent a representative. Every instinct telling you to protect yourself from reliving that boardroom said you should send a representative. You went yourself. You remember the assistant at the 40th floor reception desk doing a slight double take when you gave your name, glancing down at her screen, then back up at you, before quietly buzzing you through. You remember walking down that same hallway of glass and steel, past the same boardroom where 6 years earlier, a man had called your life's work a daydream, and feeling, for the first time in longer than you could remember, entirely unafraid. Sterling Voss stood when you walked into his office, extending a hand with the same easy, practiced confidence you remembered, clearly expecting a standard courtesy meeting with a new landlord's representative. It took him a full 3 seconds, you counted them, to place your face. Verity Ashgrove, he said slowly, something shifting behind his eyes as the pieces assembled themselves. You're You own Ashgrove Property Group? I do, you said, taking the seat across from him without waiting to be offered it. I own this building, actually. Floors 1 through 40. Which makes me your landlord? Mr. Voss, and makes this the introductory meeting my team requested for your upcoming lease renewal. You watched him recalibrate in real time, watched the memory of that boardroom, pitch surface behind his expression, watched him do the math on 6 years, on 11 properties, on the particular improbability of the young woman he'd once dismissed as a daydream now, holding the lease renewal terms for his company's entire headquarters in a folder on her lap. I remember that meeting, he said finally, quieter than you expected. I remember it more than you'd probably guess. I remember it too, you said. Every word of it, actually. There was a long pause, the kind that used to feel unbearable to you 6 years ago and now simply felt like information. A silence you could sit inside comfortably, because you had nothing left to prove in it. I was wrong, he said. It came out clipped, almost surprised at itself, like a man unused to the sentence structure. About the plan. About you. I've thought about that meeting more than once over the years. If I'm being honest, mostly. Because a few of the neighborhoods you pitched that day did exactly what you said they'd do. And I remember wondering at the time whether we'd made a mistake passing on it. You did, you said. Not unkindly, just factually. The way your father used to correct a miscalculated square footage. But it worked out fine. I built it without you. You watched something almost like respect settle into his expression, not performative. Not the polished confidence of the man from 6 years ago, but something quieter and more genuine. The specific humility of a person forced to confront in real time exactly how wrong their certainty had once been. The renewal negotiations that followed were, by any measure, fair. You didn't gouge him on rate the way some in your position might have been tempted to, the way pure vindication might have demanded. You negotiated the terms your father would have negotiated, firm, informed, entirely reasonable, reflecting genuine current market value rather than any desire to punish. But you also didn't discount it out of some misplaced generosity either. You'd learned, over 6 years of building something from nothing, that the healthiest kind of power is the kind you don't need to prove twice. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Sterling Voss began reaching out periodically, not with any agenda. Beyond genuine curiosity, asking about the neighborhoods you'd invested in, the strategy behind your acquisitions, occasionally referring smaller deals your way that didn't fit his firm's institutional appetite, but fit yours perfectly. You didn't become friends exactly, but something had shifted between you that felt less like victory and more like a strange, hard-won equilibrium. Two people who'd once occupied a boardroom with a vast and unfair power, imbalance now occupying a professional relationship built on something closer to mutual respect. 6 months after that first renewal meeting, Voss Dynamics quietly became an early investor in a scholarship fund you'd established in your father's name, a program helping first-generation students study commercial real estate and property development, the kind of opportunity that hadn't existed for you when you were coming up. Sterling didn't make a show of it. He simply signed the check and asked that his name stay off the announcement, which was, in its own way, the most convincing apology he ever offered you. You still think about that boardroom sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, but with a kind of clear-eyed gratitude that surprises you when it surfaces. You think about your father's notebooks, about the way he taught you to see potential, where other people saw nothing worth their time. You think about the studio apartment above the laundromat, the renovation weekends with drywall dust in your hair, the parking garage where you refused to cry until you were safely alone. You think most of all about how the people who laugh loudest at your daydreams are so rarely the ones who end up living inside them, and how sometimes the sweetest kind of justice isn't the loud kind, the dramatic kind, the kind you daydream about in the parking garage on your worst nights. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it just looks like signing your name on a deed, walking into a familiar hallway with your spine straight, and reminding a man who once called your life's work a well-organized daydream that daydreams, given enough patience, have a way of becoming the roof over the very people who doubted them. He called her business plan a daydream. Now he pays rent to the woman who built it brick by brick without him.